previous part of this video series, we looked at sculpting up the individual pieces of a female android, which were then moulded and cast up in resin. In this video I'm going to look at putting all of those pieces together and then adding some additional detailing to the model. So the first thing I want to do is start adding some additional detail to the spine section. I made this in the previous video out of pieces of brass tubing of various different sizes. What I now want to start doing is adding in some additional details to make it look a little bit more like a spine. So I'm drilling in some holes and then cutting in a screw thread, and that will allow me to attach some acorn nuts to either side of these brass pieces. What I've done is to cut down some M3 bolts here to provide some threaded rod that will allow me to attach the acorn nuts. So I think that's going to give the brass pieces a little bit more of a spine shape. Right, so there we go, it's looking a little bit more spine-like, but I think I still need to add some additional pieces. So what I've got are these, which are binding posts from tattoo machines. Now I used these in a previous video to hold a piece of quartz in place, but I bought a bunch of them, so I thought these would look quite good on the spine as well. So I'm thinking these can sit on the lower part of the spine like this. In order to add some additional detail, I've been going through my parts box, and what I've found are these things, which are extender adapters from RC cars. I'm not quite sure what they're used for, but they fit quite nicely through these additional pieces from the tattoo machine binding posts. I found that searching for RC car parts on eBay does yield loads and loads of really interesting mechanical and, more importantly, small scale pieces that are quite useful for projects like this. Initially I thought these might sit like this, but what I also have is some bass guitar strings, and I found that these were exactly the right size to fit through the binding posts. So what I thought would look quite cool was if these actually were attached to the spine like this. So as you can see, I've instead used the adapters to terminate the ends of those bass strings. Now on the base, what you can see I've also added is some U-brackets here, and what these are brackets that are intended to hold up glass shelves. These turned out to be exactly the right size. I bought a few different varieties from eBay, but these ones really worked. So these are brackets that are going to hold some pistons in place, and what I've done is to add some ball joints, again from remote control cars here, so that will allow the piston to move in any orientation. In order to make the pistons, I'm drilling out some brass rod on the lathe and just cutting in some detailing on the ends. So what I need to do in order to attach these to the ball joints is cut in some screw threads. I'm just using a tapping wrench there, and that allows me to attach the ball joint like that. And I can then put some steel bar into the piston. So having cut that down to size, this is what we end up with. And because of the ball joints, that allows the top of the robot to rotate around quite freely. So now for the difficult bit, posing the model. Now, because I've made all of these pieces individually, I can in theory pose this model in any way that I like, but one of the things I have found is that depending on the pose, the pieces can actually intersect together. So as you can see in the pelvis here, I've actually had to cut into the pelvis and sand away a bit to allow the leg to come up into the position that I need. I suspect this is the sort of thing that anybody who's made some form of armour perhaps or costume may have encountered. What I've done is put some threaded tube through the pelvis, and it's only tacked in place at the minute with some super glue. What I need to do is hold that in place though, because the pelvis is going to really hold the full weight of the model. It needs to be quite strong. So what I'm going to do is use this stuff, which is called Freeform Sculpt, and it's an epoxy clay from Smooth On. So I'm just going to encase the threaded rod in epoxy, and that's going to dry rock hard and will hold it in place. So there we go, that's pretty well embedded in there, so that should hold everything in place quite nicely. And my plan here is to actually drill through all of the resin pieces, put some brass rod through them. And I'm doing this for two reasons. One, to give it some strength, but also to allow me to feed some power cables through the limbs into the body. In order to further widen out the channel, I've attached a file to my drill there just so I can file away the inside of the piece. And for the feet, I've bought some additional ball joints here which will attach to the threaded rod. That means I can feed some power cables through the threaded rod and into the model. So here's the basic idea. I have some brass tube going through the leg up into the body. Now I was originally intending to use brass rod on both limbs, but it did occur to me actually that maybe I need something a little bit stronger. So what I've done instead is to buy a steel bar here of the same diameter. I can then feed that through the left leg and that's going to hold the entire model up quite nicely. Now getting the pose right is quite important, obviously, because it affects the overall look of the model, but it's also quite tricky to do because you have to drill all of the holes that you need in exactly the right orientation. So this took quite a lot of back and forth trying to get the spacing right. What I ultimately did was to get some wooden blocks, attach those to the feet and then position everything in the correct orientation before I actually fix the wooden blocks in place. Now this is only a placeholder. I need to actually attach the model to a base. So what I need to do now is put the base together and then figure out exactly how I'm going to get that to work. So I want the base to be quite large and impressive, so what I've done is to buy this ceiling light. Now the reason I want it is because it's got this nice round edge to it. Also happen to be in the DIY shop, that's B&Q if you're in the UK, and they happen to have this really nice metal grid, and I just happened to see it by accident, but I thought wow, that looks brilliant for a base. So I've bought a few pieces of this. What I'm going to do is cut out the actual centre of the ceiling lights here, then I'm going to cut the metal grid down to size so it fits inside. So I've just made myself a template in paper to get the size right. Now the grid's actually made of thin steel, so I'm using the angle grinder here to cut the shape that I need. So there we go, that looks pretty good as a first pass at a base. Now I want to add a lot more mechanical detailing on here, lots of machinery and pipes, but the most important part is figuring out exactly how the model is going to attach to this. Because the grid is see-through, I don't want to be able to see too much of the support structure underneath. So I'm thinking what I might do is add some pipes underneath the grid to hide any of the brackets that are going to hold the model in place. So in order to fit the sculpture onto the base, I need to cut down the wooden supports that I've created and hide them beneath the grid of the floor. I also need to cut a hole in the grid to allow the threaded rod to come through so I can attach the robot's foot. So there we go, not looking too bad. Obviously I need to disguise the block of wood that the robot's standing on. I'll probably cover that in some styrene plastic, I think, and add some mechanical detailing to make it look like a piece of machinery. I'm also thinking I need to add a bunch of pipes and other mechanical detailing to make the base a bit more interesting. Now that I have the model posed, I can also start looking at some further mechanical detailing. As I said in the previous video, a lot of these resin pieces are really just the basic shapes. I didn't add too much detail in because I figured I could come in afterwards and start adding mechanical detailing over the top. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just making various shaped pieces in styrene plastic and attaching them on. What I've done on the front here, I was worrying about the proportions of the model and whether the point at which the legs met the pelvis actually looked natural. So what I figured I could do was to actually reshape the pelvis slightly by adding some additional panels over the top of it and lowering some of the sections down, moving things around. So a lot of these panels are really just an attempt to try and make the pose of the robot and the body shape look a little bit more natural. Of course, I also add some nice mechanical detailing to the robot as well, so they sort of serve two purposes. The back of the torso is something that I left fairly undetailed as well, and I always intended these shapes on the back, which are actually caps from deodorant bottles, to be some form of air outlet or maybe a heat exchanger or something like that. So to that end, I want to add a lot of thin styrene plastic panels to them to convey that idea. Now, because the torso is an organic shape, it's got various curves to it, I need to actually cut my plastic quite precisely to fit those curves. So what I've got is one of these edge templates that you can get from eBay and places like that, and this is really useful for just figuring out what the curve for the pieces of plastic should be. So now I've got that, I can transfer that to the plastic and cut out the pieces I need. So there we go, I think that looks quite nice. Might need some additional small scale details on there I think, but I think the basic shape of that looks really good. Now this is an example how models tend to evolve as I make them, so I hadn't intended the arms to have that much detail to them, but once I put so much detail into the spine section of the model, I started thinking, well, maybe I should see some additional mechanical detailing in other sections of the model too. So what I've decided to do is add some bare brass and rods and mechanical elements to the arms and hands. So first off, I'm cutting some panel lines into the arms, and then I'm drilling through to try and hollow them out a little. So there's a problem straight away. I've managed to crack the resin, and I think it's partly because it's getting quite thin at the point that I'm drilling. But a blob of super glue will fix that easy enough. What I'm doing is just to use increasingly larger size drill bits to fully widen out the interior section of the arm. Now that I've got a decent sized channel in there, I'm now going to cut away some of the arm to expose the channel. This took a bit of sanding to get it right, but it wasn't too bad in the end. And just to add a bit of variety, what I'm also going to do is make some metallic pieces out of steel as well as brass to give a bit of variety to the look. So with that done, I can now put all those pieces together, and this is what I've got so far. The ball joints on the end of the arms will allow me to attach the hands in any orientation, and obviously they imply that the robot can move its hand in any way it likes, which obviously is what you want. As you can see on the left hand side, I actually screwed up the cut, so I've had to fill that section back in with some Bondo. For the upper arms, I'm also adding some additional styrene plastic pieces and some kit bash detailing. I also wanted some shoulder pads for the robot, and I did start making this template out of styrene plastic, but then I suddenly realised that what I basically needed was a sort of a spoon shape, so I thought, well, rather than mess about trying to make this from scratch, I'll just get a spoon, put some foil over it, and then sculpt a shape over that in Sculpey. So using the same process as I did for the other pieces of the robot, I've made a basic shape out of Sculpey, and then I've sanded that smooth to get the shape that I need. So I proceeded to make a mould of that, and this is what I've ended up with. The other sections here are actually arse plates, or butt plates I guess if you're in the US, so these are just to imply that some panels can slide about as the robot moves its legs. One final element that I haven't yet covered is this shin guard. I was worrying that the legs of the robot might look a little bit spindly, so I thought this might help bulk them out a little bit. And the way I made this was to bend some copper sheet into the correct shape. I then overlaid it with some glass fibre which was covered in super glue to make it rigid. Once I had the basic shape, I could then sculpt over that in Sculpey, and in the same way as I did for all the other parts of this model, I then made a mould and cast it up in resin. Now I still think this probably needs some additional mechanical detail added, so that's something I'll cover in the next part of the video. So there we go, I'm going to leave it here for this part of the video. I had a feeling we were going to probably end up with a part 4, so that's where we're going to go. So the next part of the series we'll look at adding the final detailing of the model and also painting the piece as well. So that's it, thanks very much for watching and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.